In the bitter winter of 1887, a preacher in the Kentucky mountains opened a letter that made his hands tremble so violently he nearly dropped it into the fire. The page was blotched with watermarks, perhaps tears, perhaps something darker. Inside was a confession so vile he could barely bring himself to read it aloud, let alone keep it. Before destroying the letter, he copied a handful of lines into his private journal, words that would curse him until his death 4 decades later. What he wrote was this: "Uncle Silas has claimed both Mary and Catherine as wives. The children, they bear come marked, their bodies not right, their eyes hollow. God have mercy, for our mountain kin can no longer tell the difference between devotion and damnation." That journal, hidden for over a century behind a false wall in a church basement, was unearthed in 2019. Its pages opened a door into the life of Silas Whitmore, a man whose hunger for power and blood would twist an Appalachian family into something that even now refuses to be spoken aloud. Silas Whitmore was not born a monster. He entered the world in 1834, the son of a modest mountain farmer whose land barely fed a household. The Whitmores lived in a hollow where the fog clung to the earth like a second skin, hiding sins and secrets with equal weight. By 21, Silas had married his first wife, Elena, a pale-eyed woman who bore him 3 children before tuberculosis carried her to an early grave in 1859. That death was the pivot of Silas's life. The grieving widower wore black for a season, but soon something else crept into him. Ambition twisted by grief, and grief twisted into obsession. The mountain ways had always bred peculiar habits. Neighbors married cousins, families rarely saw outsiders. But Silas began preaching something new, or at least something he claimed was new. He spoke of visions. He said God himself had whispered that the family must remain pure, untouched by foreign blood. In those isolated ridges, where no sheriff rode and no preacher dared linger, few were bold enough to challenge him. Within months of burying Elena, Silas remarried. His second wife was Margaret, Elena's own younger sister. The whispers ran through the valley, but mountain folk were cautious to condemn their own. Soon, Margaret bore Silas children too, and his homestead on Whitmore Ridge swelled with both bloodlines, sons and daughters who called him both father and uncle. But the hunger in Silas did not stop there. By the mid-1860s, he was speaking from his own pulpit, a barn converted into a chapel. He thundered about patriarchs of the Old Testament, men with multiple wives, men who had built chosen tribes. He painted himself as such a man, declaring that the mountain had chosen him, and the people listened. Some believed him, some feared him, and some, having no way to leave these ridges, simply kept their silence. It was in this season that 2 girls entered his household. Mary and Catherine Holbrook, nieces by blood, brought to Whitmore Ridge after their parents perished in a wagon accident. Mary, 17, had black hair and green eyes sharp as winter glass. Catherine, only 15, had a softness that seemed too fragile for the harsh Appalachian winters. Orphans with no home, they fell under Silas's guardianship and into the snare of his obsession. In the spring of 1866, Silas Whitmore declared what he called his divine revelation, that he was to take both sisters as wives, not one, both. He told the valley that the union was holy, commanded by God, that from their blood would spring children with gifts beyond ordinary men. The words were not offered as persuasion. They were an ultimatum, delivered in the tone of a prophet. Margaret, his current wife, their aunt, could object, but her voice was drowned by Silas's sermons and his rising temper. What remained of her resistance was buried in silence. The so-called wedding took place in Silas's chapel. There was no minister, no witnesses beyond the family and a handful of neighbors too cowed to intervene. Silas bound himself to Mary and Catherine in a ritual of his own making, swearing that heaven itself had sanctioned this marriage of uncle to nieces. From that day, Whitmore Ridge became more than a homestead. It became a compound. The walls expanded, the children multiplied. And so did the whispers of deformities, strange births and marks carried by the babies born of these unholy vows. What grew on Whitmore Ridge after Silas's union with Mary and Catherine was not a family. It was a hierarchy. At the top stood Silas, self-proclaimed prophet, the chosen vessel. Below him were his wives, ranked and arranged like tools in a box. Margaret, though his only legal wife, was relegated to cooking, cleaning and caring for the youngest children. Mary and Catherine, still little more than girls, were kept in separate rooms, called out according to Silas's divine schedule. He claimed that God himself dictated which bed he would share and when. Sometimes he vanished into the woods for days with one or both of the sisters, returning with wild eyes and muttered sermons about revelations received in secret places. The children, too, lived under rules etched into silence. They were forbidden to question, forbidden to leave, forbidden even to speak of what they saw. They learned to move through the compound like shadows, keeping their heads low. Many of them bore unsettling similarities. The same sharp eyes, the same narrow jaws, the same way their hands curled when they slept. The resemblance grew too close, generation by generation, and the signs of inbreeding could no longer be ignored. But in the mountain community, silence was survival. Neighbors whispered of strange cries heard at night, of children who did not live past infancy, of graves dug quickly and covered over before the morning fog lifted. Yet no one confronted Silas. His word had become law. To question him was to question God. And no one dared risk it. Behind closed doors, the Whitmore house became a theater of psychological torment. Silas had built a system where compliance earned small mercies, while resistance meant punishment. Isolation in a locked room, days without food, or public humiliation during his Sunday sermons. He turned his wives against one another, urging them to confess each other's doubts, to betray whispers of rebellion. Slowly they became enforcers of his rule, not protectors of one another. What horrified outsiders most, years later, was not only the polygamy, not only the incest, but the way Silas convinced his family that their suffering was sacred. If Mary or Catherine wept, he told them it was a trial sent from God. If children were born weak or deformed, he said it was proof that Satan tested their bloodline. Everything that should have broken him was twisted into evidence of divine favor. By the early 1870s, the Whitmore Ridge compound housed more than 24 souls, wives, children, and grandchildren bound together by fear and blood. And still, Silas's hunger grew. He told the Hollow that his tribe was God's chosen people, and he began arranging matches among his own children and grandchildren, weaving the family tree into a knot that could no longer be untangled. To outsiders, it looked like devotion. Inside the walls, it was horror. A nightmare lived in whispers, where even the children forgot what life looked like beyond Whitmore Ridge. By the 1880s, Silas Whitmore's name had become both feared and untouchable. The ridge bore his mark. Every cabin belonged to his kin. Every acre of corn and tobacco sprouted from land he claimed. Outsiders rarely ventured up the trail, and those who did seldom returned twice. They spoke of the silence, no bird song, no laughter of children, only the heavy stillness of watchful eyes from shaded porches. Rumors spread through the valley towns like sickness. Some claimed Silas kept more than 2 wives, that younger daughters, and nieces had been dedicated to him in secret ceremonies. Others whispered of children born in such unnatural ways they were hidden before strangers could glimpse them. Yet when ministers or county men tried to investigate, they met walls of silence. The Whitmores refused to speak. They denied nothing, admitted nothing. The local sheriff once rode up the ridge with a deputy after reports of screaming in the night. He returned pale, muttering that the matter was a church affair. He never climbed that mountain again. Over time, lawmen stopped answering calls. The Whitmores had become their own law. Meanwhile, the outside world moved on. Railroads cut through nearby counties. Schools rose in towns. But Whitmore Ridge remained frozen in time, sealed by its own blood. The children grew up knowing only their kin. Many never learned to read or write. Their only lessons came from Silas's sermons, in which he declared that the Whitmore line was chosen to remain pure, untouched by outsiders. He thundered from his pulpit that tainted blood brings ruin. His flock, bound by fear and faith, nodded in silence. Neighbors kept their distance, but the whispers carried on. A midwife confided to her sister about stillborns with twisted limbs. A store clerk noted how the Whitmore boys all bore the same narrow face, the same distant stare. Teachers who briefly tried to educate the Ridge children left shaken, unable to put into words the strange quiet in their eyes. The Whitmores became a living ghost story. Children in town were warned not to wander toward the ridge. Young men dared one another to climb the path, only to return pale and silent, unwilling to describe what they had seen. Silas's power lay not in his strength, but in the silence he cultivated, a silence so deep it smothered truth, leaving only fear in its place. And yet cracks had begun to show. By the late 1880s, Silas was aging. His once commanding voice grew hoarse, his body weaker. But his control, stronger than ever. He whispered that when he died, his spirit would live on in the blood of his wives, his children, his grandchildren. The bloodline itself had become his church, and escape was unthinkable. The valley watched, helpless. The Whitmores had become an empire of secrecy, and every year their silence grew louder. When Silas Whitmore finally drew his last breath, the ridge did not mourn. His two nieces, wives, mothers, prisoners, stood at the foot of his bed, their faces hollow, their eyes unreadable. Children wept quietly, but not from grief. For them, his death brought no freedom, only the passing of a curse from one generation to the next. The county expected the Whitmore clan to scatter, but instead they folded tighter into themselves. The nieces raised the children together, enforcing the same rules Silas had lived by. No outsiders, no new blood. The sermons continued, now spoken in hushed tones at the hearth, instead of a pulpit. His voice, though gone, lingered in their rituals, their silence, their fear. For decades after, Whitmore Ridge remained an island of shadows. The children grew, married each other, bore children of their own. Graves filled with nameless markers. Census rolls showed strange gaps. Outsiders learned not to ask questions. Even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb the ridge. But stories survived. A stranger hiking the woods claimed to see a girl with features so blurred, so indistinct, that he could not tell her age. An old doctor whispered of patients whose blood seemed too close to itself. And neighbors swore that on quiet nights, the faint sound of hymns still drifted down from the ridge, voices chanting words long since erased from any church book. Today, the Whitmores are almost gone, absorbed into silence, into the soil of the mountains. But some say their descendants still walk among us, that when you look closely into certain faces, you see the echo of Silas Whitmore. The patriarch who married his own blood, bound his family in silence, and built one of Appalachia's darkest legacies. The ridge is overgrown now. The cabins rot into the ground. But the silence remains. A silence too heavy to be explained away. A silence that is not empty, but waiting.